By the time the interview ended, Donald Trump would do something unprecedented on live television. He would stop defending a story he had told for 8 years. One question from his own daughter would make him go silent for 17 seconds, and those 17 seconds would circulate on every news platform in America within an hour. What made him abandon a narrative he had built an entire foreign policy argument around? You're going to want to hear this. The Fox Business Network studio was set to Trump's exact specifications. The lighting had been adjusted 3 times. His preferred chair had been brought in from another building. The host had been briefed not to fact check in real time. This was supposed to be a victory lap, a friendly interview to promote his new book about his presidential accomplishments. The segment was titled The Art of the China Deal, and Trump had spent 40 minutes in the green room rehearsing his talking points with 2 advisors who nodded at everything he said. He entered the studio with the confidence of a man who had told this story so many times that it had calcified into gospel. China had been ripping America off for decades. He was the only president strong enough to stand up to them. He had single-handedly forced them to the negotiating table. He had secured the greatest trade deal in American history. Every network that had challenged these claims was fake news. Every economist who had questioned the numbers was a partisan hack. The story was perfect, polished, and according to Trump, completely unassailable. The host opened with the softest possible question, practically reading from the talking points Trump's team had provided. Trump leaned back in his chair and smiled. He launched into the familiar narrative. China had stolen trillions from American workers. Obama had done nothing. Bush had done nothing. He had walked into the Oval Office and immediately gotten tough. The tariffs had worked. The Phase 1 deal had been historic. China had respected him because he was unpredictable, strong, and willing to walk away from any table. He gestured broadly, his voice rising with theatrical indignation at the previous administration's weakness. Then he said it. The line he had repeated in dozens of interviews, rallies, and speeches. Ivanka was there. She saw it all. She saw how Xi looked at me with respect when I told him we were putting tariffs on $500 billion of Chinese goods. She saw the fear in their eyes. My daughter understood what we were doing better than any so-called expert in Washington. The host nodded approvingly and started to transition to the next question. And that's when Ivanka Trump walked onto the set. She had not been scheduled to appear. The production team scrambled, confused, as she moved calmly past the cameras and took the empty chair beside the host. Trump's face registered surprise, then delight. His daughter had come to support him on live television. He reached over to touch her hand. She smiled at him, but something in her expression was carefully neutral, the kind of smile that requires effort to maintain. She waited until the host finished fumbling through an improvised introduction. Then she spoke, her voice quiet and precise. Dad, I need to clarify something you just said. You mentioned I was there when you threatened China with $500 billion in tariffs and saw Xi's reaction. I need to correct that for the record. Trump's hand, which had been gesturing, stopped midair. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had just heard a fire alarm in a building they thought was empty. The host glanced between them, suddenly aware that the friendly interview had become something else entirely. Ivanka reached into a leather portfolio she had brought with her and removed a document. She placed it on the table between them with the deliberate care of someone setting down something fragile and dangerous. This is the visitor log from the Oval Office for September 14th, 2018. That's the day you've said in 3 different interviews that I was present when you threatened President Xi with $500 billion tariffs during a phone call. You described my reaction. You said I nodded at you and mouthed the words, "He's scared." She turned the document so the camera could see it, her finger pointing to a highlighted line. I was in Shanghai that day, Dad. I was meeting with the U.S. Commercial Service about trademark applications for my brand. I have the flight manifest, the hotel records, and photographs with timestamps. I was 11,000 miles away. The studio went completely silent. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked at the document, then at his daughter, then back at the document. His face, which had been animated moments before, went carefully still. The host did not interrupt. The cameras kept rolling. Ivanka continued, her tone remaining gentle but unyielding. That's not the only time, though. You've also said I was present in the Oval Office on June 7th, 2019, when you claim you told Treasury Secretary Mnuchin to prepare tariffs on all remaining Chinese imports. You've described me standing by the Resolute desk reviewing the proposed tariff list with you. She removed a second document from her portfolio. This is my public schedule from that week. On June 7th, I was testifying before the Senate Commerce Committee about workforce development programs. The hearing lasted 4 hours. C-SPAN has the full video. I wasn't in the Oval Office that day. I wasn't even in the same building. Trump shifted in his chair. His mouth opened again, and this time a sound came out, but it was not a word. It was something between a cough and an attempt to speak that collapsed before forming syllables. His hand moved toward the documents, hesitated, then retreated to his lap. And there's more. Ivanka's voice remained calm, almost apologetic, as though she regretted having to continue but knew she had no choice. She produced a third document, this one thicker than the others. You've told a story in your book, in interviews, and at rallies about a dinner in Beijing where I sat next to you and Chinese officials and translated a conversation because the official translator had gotten something wrong. You said I corrected the translator in Mandarin and that President Xi was so impressed he offered me a position in his government as a joke. She opened the document to a marked page. This is the official record of your state visit to Beijing in November 2017. The dinner you're describing did happen, but I wasn't seated next to you. The seating chart is public record. I was at a separate table with other family members and junior officials. And Dad, I don't speak Mandarin. I've never claimed to speak Mandarin. I took 2 semesters of French at boarding school and barely passed. There is no recording of me translating anything because it never happened. The silence that followed was extraordinary. 5 seconds. 10, 15. The host looked down at his notes, clearly uncertain whether to intervene. The production crew in the control room watching on monitors stopped moving. One camera operator would later describe it as the longest 17 seconds he had ever witnessed on live television. Trump's face went through a series of changes. First confusion, as though he were searching his memory and finding something different than what was being described. Then a flash of anger, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing at the documents on the table. But the anger did not hold. It dissolved into something more complicated. His shoulders dropped slightly. His hands, which had been ready to gesture in dismissal, went still in his lap. Finally, he spoke. Sweetheart, I think you're misremembering some of these dates. His voice was quieter than it had been during the opening segment, missing its usual bombast. It was the voice of someone testing a defense they did not quite believe. Ivanka did not raise her voice. I'm not misremembering, Dad. I have the documentation. Flight records are public. C-SPAN video is archived. Seating charts from state dinners are preserved by the State Department. You've told these stories so many times that I think you believe them. But they're not true. I wasn't there. She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something almost tender in her voice, which made what she said next even more devastating. And here's what worries me. If these stories about me being present aren't true, what else in the China narrative isn't true? Because you've used my presence as proof. You've said my daughter was there, she saw it, ask her. But I wasn't there. So what was I supposed to have seen? Trump's next defense came faster, a reflexive pivot to a familiar strategy. The fake news media has been after me from day one. They'll twist anything. You're taking this out of context. The important thing is that we got tough on China when nobody else would. The details don't matter. The details do matter, though. Ivanka's voice remained level. Because other people have been checking. The $500 billion tariff threat you mentioned earlier? The Washington Post reviewed the timeline. The threat wasn't made on September 14th. It was made 3 weeks later on October 4th, and it wasn't $500 billion. It was $200 billion. And it wasn't delivered in a phone call with Xi. It was announced in a press release. She pulled another document from her portfolio, and Trump visibly flinched. This is the actual USTR statement from October 2018. $200 billion, not $500. Press release, not phone call. And I wasn't in the Oval Office for the decision because the decision wasn't made in the Oval Office. It was made in a cabinet meeting you attended remotely because you were in New Jersey that day. The host finally attempted to intervene, his voice uncertain. Mr. President, would you like to respond to... Let him respond. Ivanka's interruption was polite but firm. She looked at her father, and for a moment, the studio cameras captured something rarely seen on Trump's face, genuine uncertainty. He looked at his daughter, at the stack of documents, at the cameras, and then back at his daughter. I've told a version of events as I remember them, he said slowly, each word chosen with unusual care. Memory isn't always perfect. Things get compressed. I've done a lot of deals. This isn't about memory compression, Dad. Ivanka's response was immediate and precise. You've told the same specific false stories with the same specific false details in interviews, in your book, and at rallies. You didn't misremember the date I was in Shanghai. You invented my presence in a room I was never in to make a threat sound more dramatic. You didn't compress the timeline of the tariff announcement. You changed the amount, the method, and your location to make yourself sound more decisive. These aren't memory errors. These are choices. Trump's face was unreadable now. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching the moment when his mouth opened and closed without sound. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. 20 years of media training, thousands of hours of combative interviews, an entire career built on never admitting fault, and yet he sat there silent as his own daughter dismantled the story he had built his entire China policy legacy on. And the people who suffer when these stories circulate are real, Ivanka continued. American manufacturers who believed your version of the tariff timeline made business decisions based on false information. Trade negotiators who had to explain to their international counterparts why the president's public statements didn't match the documented record. Families who voted for you because they believed you had personally stared down China and won, they deserved the truth. They deserved to know that the $500 billion phone call with Xi never happened, that I was never in the room nodding approval, that the translator's story in Beijing was fiction. The host attempted once more to redirect. Perhaps we should take a commercial break and... No. Trump's voice cut through, and for a moment it had some of its old force. No break. He looked at Ivanka, and something in his expression softened. Why are you doing this? On television? Now? Because you keep telling these stories, Dad, and you keep using my name to validate them. Ivanka was there. Ivanka saw it. Ask Ivanka. But I wasn't there. And every time you say I was, you make me complicit in something that isn't true. I can't let that continue. Trump looked down at his hands. When he looked up again, his voice was different, smaller. Some of the details might be off. The core of what happened is still true. We got tough on China. We put tariffs in place. We changed the relationship. You put some tariffs in place, Ivanka said quietly. And then you signed a phase 1 deal that China never fully implemented. And then you left office with the trade deficit with China higher than when you started. Those are the documented facts. The dramatic stories you've told about forcing Xi to his knees with threats I witnessed, those didn't happen. The translator moment that impressed Chinese officials never occurred. The tough guy image you've built, it's built on stories that don't match the public record. The silence that followed was longer than the first. 23 seconds this time, though it felt like minutes. The host sat frozen. The crew waited. Trump looked at his daughter, and whatever he saw in her face seemed to drain the fight out of him. What do you want me to say? He asked finally, his voice barely audible. I want you to stop telling stories that use me as proof when I wasn't there. I want you to stop claiming things happened that didn't happen. And I want you to understand that when you do this, you're not just lying to the public. You're asking everyone who knows the truth to choose between you and reality. I don't want to make that choice anymore. Trump's next words shocked everyone in the studio, everyone watching at home, and possibly Trump himself. Some of the stories might have gotten bigger in the telling. It was not an apology. It was barely an admission. But coming from Donald Trump on live television, it was seismic. The host, sensing the moment, tried to rap. We'll be right back after this, but Ivanka wasn't finished. You opened this interview by saying, I understood your China policy better than any expert in Washington. You were using me again, Dad. Using my supposed presence and approval to validate a story you've told so many times you can't separate it from what actually happened. But I'm telling you now, on the record, with documentation, I wasn't in those rooms. Those conversations didn't happen the way you've described them, and you need to stop saying they did. She stood, gathering her documents back into the portfolio. She leaned over and kissed her father on the cheek, a gesture so at odds with what had just transpired that it felt almost surreal. I love you, she said quietly, just loud enough for the microphones to catch. But I won't lie for you anymore. As she walked off the set, Trump sat motionless in his chair. The host, unsure of what to do, turned to the camera and called for a commercial break. But the cameras kept rolling for another 8 seconds, capturing Trump's face as he watched his daughter leave. His expression was complicated, hurt, anger, and something that might have been shame, all competing for space on a face that had spent decades refusing to show vulnerability. When the show returned from commercial, Trump was gone. The host explained that the president had needed to leave for another commitment. The remainder of the interview was canceled, but the damage was complete in public. Within an hour, the clip of Ivanka's confrontation was the top story on every major news network. The 17-second silence and the 23-second silence became the most replayed moments of the day. Conservative outlets tried to frame it as a family disagreement. Liberal outlets called it a reckoning. But everyone agreed on one thing. Trump's China story, the one he had told for 8 years, the one he had built an entire foreign policy legacy around, was now indefensible. Because his own daughter had brought the receipts. Flight manifests, visitor logs, C-SPAN archives, State Department seating charts, hotel records with timestamps. Every story Trump had told with Ivanka as his witness had been systematically dismantled with documentation that couldn't be dismissed as fake news or partisan attacks. These were official records. These were publicly available archives. These were facts. And Trump, for perhaps the first time in his public life, had no answer. He had sat in silence. He had admitted, however reluctantly, that some of the stories might have gotten bigger in the telling. He had watched his daughter walk away rather than continue defending him, and he had left the set without finishing the interview designed to celebrate his greatest accomplishments. The question Ivanka had posed hung in the air long after the broadcast ended. If these stories about me being present aren't true, what else in the China narrative isn't true? It was the simplest possible question. It had no good answer. Because if the dramatic moments Trump had described, the $500 billion threat, the translator correction, the dinner table negotiations, if all of those were fabrications built on the false foundation of Ivanka's presence, then what remained of the story? What part of the tough guy narrative survived when the witness testimony it relied on was proven false? This wasn't a political opponent challenging Trump's version of events. This wasn't a journalist fact-checking his claims. This was his daughter, the person he had repeatedly used as validation, publicly stating that she would not let him use her name to validate lies anymore. The impact of that would outlast any news cycle. In the hours after the interview, reporters began reviewing every instance where Trump had claimed Ivanka was present during China negotiations. They found 17 separate occasions across interviews, rallies, and his book. In 14 of those 17 instances, public records showed Ivanka was either in a different city, at a public event, or testifying before Congress. The 3 remaining instances occurred at large meetings where she may have been present but was not seated near Trump and could not have witnessed the conversations he described. The pattern was clear and devastating. Trump had not simply misremembered or compressed timelines. He had systematically invented his daughter's presence at key moments to add credibility to stories that otherwise had no witnesses and contradicted the public record. He had used her name as a shield against fact-checking, assuming no one would verify whether she was actually there. And when his daughter finally did verify on live television with documentation, the entire structure collapsed. Trump's team spent the rest of the day in damage control mode, but every statement they released made things worse. They claimed Ivanka had been confused about the dates, but she had brought flight manifests and hotel records. They said her public schedule didn't reflect private meetings, but she had brought C-SPAN video showing her at a Senate hearing during the time Trump claimed she was in the Oval Office. They tried to argue that the core story was still true even if the details were wrong, but the details were the story. The entire narrative depended on specific dramatic moments that had never occurred. By evening, even Fox News had stopped defending the China story. The silence Trump had exhibited during those 17 seconds and then those 23 seconds played on loop on every network. Political analysts from across the spectrum agreed that they had never seen Trump so thoroughly dismantled, and certainly never by someone from his own family. The opening of the interview felt like it had happened weeks ago, though it had been only hours. Trump had walked onto that set believing he was there for a victory lap, ready to promote a book about his accomplishments, surrounded by friendly questioners and perfect lighting. He had opened by invoking his daughter's presence as proof of his strength with China. And his daughter had responded by proving he had lied about her presence, about the timeline, about the amounts, about the method, about the location, about nearly every detail of the story he had told most often. You questioned your own credibility at the start of this interview, Mr. President, by using your daughter as validation for stories she's now proven never happened. But she's not the one whose career depends on those stories being true. You are. And she just made it impossible for you to tell them again.